every single one of us, and in our audience and out of our audience through life, has experienced trauma. Some of it is recognizable and memorable, and some of it is not. Some of it we don't remember. Some of it is extreme, like sexual abuse, and some of it is less so, like getting yelled at. But they're all traumatic experiences that, if unaddressed, they fester in our subconscious and they attack us as if they're happening again right now. Welcome to the Imperfect Men's Club podcast. I'm Mark Aylward.
I'm Jim Gurley. Thanks for being here.
This podcast is a space for men to have real, raw, and often difficult conversations to help guide middle-aged men through making hard decisions in life. Both Jim and I are mentors focused on leading consciously. Tune in every week to have honest and often humorous discussions on well-being, personal growth, and professional development.
Enjoy the show.
Okay, welcome to the Imperfect Men's Club podcast. My name is Mark Aylward, and I'm here with my colleague and friend, Jim Gurley. And today we're going to talk about identity. So as a middle-aged man, who are you? Jim, you and I were talking about this prior to getting on the podcast, and we were talking about the fact that we both played sports growing up and how that shaped us. And maybe you can continue that train of thought now for our listeners.
Yeah, Mark, what I was referring to was we played sports, but also the impact sports has on us in those early years as a young man. You know, I'll just throw it out there as junior high school and high school years, maybe even before. But so today we're going to talk about identity, and there's no question that your identities linked with your environment, and as we're shaping the way we view the world, that happens, you know, with that 10 to 15-year-old, 10 to 20-year-old especially is when we become who we are. It's kind of our personalities and so on. So we were talking about the different sport teams. I'm on the West Coast, Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area. You grew up on the East Coast, the Boston area. And the subject or the topic was, how much do those sports teams affect us and during that era? In my case, it was the Oakland Raiders was everything to us. That was just that, and the Oakland A's, because I'm an East Bay guy, which is different than the San Francisco Giants and the San Francisco 49ers. And then there are the Warriors, of course. They all played in the same Coliseum, which was about 15 minutes from where I grew up in Hayward. And the mentality and everything about it. But what do you think? What are your thoughts about that and how that plays into our life and our careers and just how we view the world?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about it. I mean, I grew up in a family where we all played sports. We played tennis. The whole family did. I played soccer, and the older I got, the more you had to make choices. You couldn't play 6 or 7 different sports. I think back in the day, the best athletes played 3 or 2. Very few of us played just one. I played baseball and basketball, and mostly because my father was a baseball fan, and basketball because I grew into some height my junior year. And that was back in the day when the Red Sox sucked, and they lost everything, from 67 to 78 to or 75, 78, 86. I mean, we were on the precipice of winning and lost every time. The Patriots sucked, and of course, the last 10 years they've been nothing but awesome. And then the Celtics, Bill Russell, 11 out of 13 titles, and the Bruins, the Bobby Orr Bruins, Phil Esposito Bruins. So big sports town, and that's all anybody talked about. All the guys talked about, all the side talk was about sports and who was doing what. And I think to some extent, when everybody's losing, you kind of get used to it, and that's not a really good thing. And conversely, I would imagine, particularly with the Raiders, with Al Davis and all those John Madden teams and stuff, from Kenny Stabler on and all that winning, you get used to that too. And you have that expectation. And I think that in hindsight, I probably wasn't conscious of it at the time, but I'll tell you what, I much prefer the last 10, 15 years of Boston sports than I did the first 10 or 15. But I think it also breeds something that really comes in handy when you're playing sports and maybe isn't as good a tool when you stop playing, which is competitiveness. I was
Yeah.
very, very competitive as an athlete, and I hated losing. I loved winning, and I was willing to do whatever it took within the boundaries of the rules, sometimes even outside the boundaries of the rules, to be aggressive. And I found as a father of daughters that my identity has had to evolve. That competitive nature about everything, and it's just counterproductive when you get older in most situations. So I think it has a huge part in forming your identity.
Yeah, no question. And your mother was an athlete, right?
My mother was a fantastic athlete. Yeah,
Mhm.
she was a fantastic athlete. My father was a good athlete too. He was a fighter pilot, so he had the hand-eye coordination, but she was athletically graceful.
Yeah. And at that time, women's sports was not as nearly popular as they are today. So it's interesting that she brought you along into that, or your brothers and you. Yeah, it's three of you, or you have a
I have an older brother, a younger brother, and a younger sister. And
yes. Okay, yeah.
yeah, my older brother had professional baseball possibilities as a pitcher, and I had them as a player. And my sister was captain of her Georgetown tennis team, and my mom and dad actually won the mixed doubles town tournament when I won the 14 and unders, and my sister won the 12 and unders all in the same year, as I recall. I gave up tennis because I had to choose between tennis and baseball, and I chose baseball same season, you know.
Mhm. So back to identity. Your identity was directly related uh, to the enthusiasm that you saw in your parents. They influenced you, but also that's probably where you also received a lot of validation, right? Because they saw um, the importance of sports or how that can convey over. So this ties directly into your identity of being competitive and being an athlete. Don't you think that's part of kind of what shapes you to this day?
No question. I mean, I always, sometimes you feel like you're still 17 or 18
Mhm.
trapped in an older body, but I have always identified as an athlete. And I think most people who know me would use that word in their primary description of who I am, even though I don't competitively compete anymore. I still do a lot of different exercising and stuff, but I've always looked at myself as an athlete. It's who I am, who I was, what I am, and the reason behind why I did a lot of what I did, the choices that I made. And I'm sure you're the same. I mean, you played professional rugby for years and
Well,
achieved
it wasn't professional.
greatness.
They didn't have professional at the time. They do now. It just started actually. It's my background's a little different than yours because my parents did not play sports. My dad was more of an engineer type, but yeah, as far as the sports, the summertime was the Oakland A's. The obviously the fall was the Oakland Raiders, and I didn't follow basketball much, but um, because I had four brothers and sisters, and a very middle class family, stable middle class family. Um, I wouldn't say we were discouraged to do sports, but it wasn't in the budget, if that makes sense. I mean, it was expensive. The kids that had um, money off more money would be involved in those sports. So it's not like I never played little league baseball. It it just wasn't as much part of the early childhood. When we got into grade school, that's when I was introduced to sports. And and then like I mentioned earlier, I started to wrestle, um, which was probably the first major failure and major success because I remember it was I went to high school, junior high school with two levels, so seventh and eighth grade, and I went out for the wrestling team. I don't know why. I think I just wanted to belong to something, and I made the wrestling team, and then we all went to a tournament, and everybody did pretty well, and I didn't do so well, and they announced it over the loudspeaker at the following Monday, and I was just devastated. Like, everybody did well except Jimmy Gurley. That's what they refer to me. And then I came back the next year and joined a wrestling team and ended up, like I told you, I ended up beating the number one wrestler in the country in the Bay Area to become the number one wrestler from zero to hero. Um, and and that was also a big part of the childhood because the Oakland Raiders would always come from behind. Maybe remember Kenny Stabler
Oh
to
yeah.
Branch. So there was always this come from behind, winning at the last second, and just the glory of that. Um, and even and it's also even the A's and the East Bay were seen as kind of second class citizens. That's a known if you know anything about the San Francisco Bay Area. San Francisco and that side of the bay is, definitely they consider themselves at the time um, the more affluent side of the Bay Area. So the Raiders were the ragtag team that would always come from behind uh, and win it with heart. Often not as much talent, it was heart. And then that became very much part of my high school football experience and everything I did in life. I took that straight into high school sports and on.
I tell this story a lot. The reason I played baseball is not necessarily because baseball was my favorite sport. It's because my father loved baseball.
Mm.
And he was a kid throwing peanuts around in Fenway Park back in the 30s and 40s. And Ted Williams was his idol and one of mine. And then Dwight Evans, the right fielder for the Red Sox, had a gun for an arm. He was my idol, and I was an outfielder. But it's so random. And when we get to middle age and we reflect back on our identity and who we are and who we were and who we want to become and all these things, I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of the things that we're doing right now or have done were relatively random in nature and born of circumstances that weren't really part of any plan. If my father, I mean, I'm 6'4.5", and I became a really good basketball player, but I didn't play basketball until my junior year because that wasn't a thing in my family. We didn't follow basketball. And I fell in love with it, and I think I was better at it than I was at baseball, and I was pretty good at baseball. But it's not a right or wrong thing. But I think a reevaluation of your identity periodically throughout your life is a valuable exercise because, why am I who I am? What
Yeah.
am I? And where did this come from? And when is it time to like reevaluate things? I think it's kind of as far as your identity and your purpose and your passion and your direction, I think reevaluating that in midlife periodically is very healthy.
Let's go with that. I do think it's important. Reevaluate, but also recalibrate your self worth. I talk about this a lot because often our value is shaped based on maybe an experience in sports, for good or for bad. I've taken a quite a turn to my surprise, where at one point I was all about winning and the best, and I still feel that way as far as competitiveness. But being involved with my nonprofit and mentoring hundreds of young men, uh, and also having two children to go through high school sports, I started to see um, some things play out, and often the best player on the team um, would have extremely high self worth, to the point where when things went bad, then for him on the field, then the whole team would go bad, and I could see that. And then also I would notice that the players that went on had some setbacks early on, and they weren't always just this. Just because you're a star player in sports in high school uh, doesn't equal a star player in life. And I also started to begin to see the value of that kid that would not start all the games, but he would show up to practice and he would be a part of it. And often those guys, those kids come back later and do good things because it's hard to show up when you're not getting play time. It's easy to show up when you're star of the team. So I'm a big also believer in your identity could be based on maybe some early failures that you learn by and recover. But if you have too much success early on, then that also can give you a false sense of importance that you try to bring into the world. And that. So I think we overdo it sometimes on transferring that things don't change later on in life. There's some advantages to having failures early on, as long as you don't let it damage you. What do you think about that?
No question. I think the ability to overcome hardship is a life skill that
Mhm.
and I think the other thing about it, Jim, is that you can fail, then you can succeed, then you can fail. I mean, failure is not a one-time thing. I think in my mind, and as a career coach, for lack of a better title, among many things, when I interview people or prepare people for interviews, I always focus on their story. I talked about this in one of the other podcast episodes, but I want to know how you are at overcoming hardship. And that's pretty much all I want to know, because if you tell me that story, or you have the ability to tell that story, depending on what seat you're in, the interviewer or the interviewee, that tells me everything about you, because that tells me how self accountable you are. That tells me how consistent you are, how you don't seek to blame other people or other things. It gives me tremendous insight. It tells me how you solve problems and how you react to hardship. Because if I hire you in a sales capacity, for instance, you're going to bump into hardship all the time. People are going to tell you suck. They're going to hang up the phone on you. I want to know how you're going to handle that. And I think sports might be, for people like you and me, men who played sports, might be where that starts. That process of learning starts. This is just a thing. You can't win every game. You can't win every match. You can't score every goal. You can't hit every shot. Not every at bat's a home run. I mean, that's not the way this shit works. So there's so many little places in competitive sports, particularly team sports, where there are life lessons to be learned. And I'm very grateful for having had that experience as a young man, because it's come in handy as a middle-aged man, an older man.
It, and this goes back to young men. My mission, and all based on this book. It's called The Season of Life. And at the time, Jack was the head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I told him about it. And turns out that he had just read the book and then gave it to all his players, kind of mandatory reading as I think a first or second year head coach in the NFL. And the book talks about well, it's about an NFL player, and he later on in life does well in the NFL, and he becomes a kind of a superstar, all pro guy. Um, and then he started to struggle when football was over, which is not uncommon. He struggled to the point where he had to deal with some real issues um, of his identity of being an NFL player and the relationship he had with his father. He had an abusive father, so his father used to beat up his mother, and some bad stuff. And then he had this. It was a spiritual event of some kind, and he's a pastor now, I believe. But the book does a really good job of talking about how, uh, in order to make the world a better place, we have to raise young men to become men. And he went back and used high school football uh, in order to have an influence on this young group of men. And I don't want to give away the book, but the one scene, I'll never forget it because I think it explains it. This is the beginning of the season, and the kids were warming up before a football game, and one of the parents walked up and said, "Hey, coach, uh, what do you think of the team this year?" And he looks up and he looks at the team. He looks at the team as they're warming up, and he looks down. He looks up and he goes, "I'll tell you in 30 years." And that explains everything, because what a team does, especially a young man, you have belonging. You also realize you can't do it all yourself. You have to show up. It's about showing up to practice when it's cold, when it's wet, when you're hungry. It's difficult, and that's what I have learned to appreciate about sports, because nothing comes easy, and it's not what happens on the field. It happens at the practice, and it happens. But the other reason I did it was because the impact that those coaches had at that stage as a freshman in high school was huge. There's no question that a strong male role model. Uh, Not only would I listen to them, but I respected them, and they shaped my personality through this game of football. But it really had nothing to do with football. It was belonging to somebody, and then of course all my best friends I still talk to them to this day. Just becomes your community. I have a daughter that went the opposite direction. She went into drama, which is what do you call that? The arts. One summer, my wife came to me and she said, Julie wants to do the banquet at our house. And I said, sure, that's fine. So we did in the backyard. And I remember coming home from work and they had this, it was a banquet for their drama shows. And I just remember saying, wow. And they were handing out awards for their different parts. They were so excited and they were so pumped up. It was like a football banquet. And I started to realize the importance of having different activities. It doesn't have to be about sports, and the world needs everybody, right? That creative mind.
Sports was what we know, but I seen it as well. And, it could be a dance group. It could be, a military squadron. It could be a class that's all learning the same thing at the same time, collectively, collaboratively. But I think that, as far as our demographic, as far as middle-aged men is concerned, I think the other thing to point out is that we're all walking around as examples of men, if we're men, and we have an obligation, I think, to be an example, because young men who interact with us, from eye contact to a firm handshake to a yes sir,
Mhm.
that kind of respectful behavior is born out of some of these institutions like sports, right? And hierarchies, and the concept of meritocracy and winning and losing and fair play and competition. I think we have an obligation. I feel, I don't know how you feel, but I feel like when I'm walking around, like for instance, all of my children's friends, I was an example for them as they were growing up. And it wasn't just what I said, it was actually far more what I did. The consistency with what I did, how my actions and my words were the same. They didn't contradict one another. Constantly showing up, being on time, helping, advising, answering questions, making people feel safe. I think these are all things that we have an obligation to be. And when you let it slide in middle age, which so many of my friends and colleagues have done, like getting fat and out of shape and eating poorly, and getting these machines to help them sleep. What do you call those things? Sleep apnea machines. Like they're looking forward to getting one in the mail. I'm like, just stop eating shit and start walking around. I think this middle age thing, as I've said before, it's a crossroads. I mean, you and I met because you were bumping up against a particular hardship that you thought was coming, at least in part, from your rigorous activity and the concussions that came from that. And I believe you sensed, I got to do something about this, because if I don't do something about it, it's going to get worse. And if you get worse, then then your wife's life gets worse, your kids' life gets worse, your friends' lives get worse, and you have an obligation to prop yourself up and keep yourself in good condition, and a strong immune system and a good attitude and a consistent work ethic and things of that nature. I really think that's important, and I think that should resonate with our audience.
I had solid coaches that modeled what you did. They set it. They had a high standard, and they held us to that standard. So the modeling, whether you're a parent or a coach or an influencer of a young man, there's no question shapes who they become in their identity. And I saw a lot of um, damage in terms of fathers putting almost too much emphasis on their child's let's just say field performance in relationship to their relationship. So I've seen sports do as much damage as I have seen it um, do good. And we often don't talk about that. You can have trauma from the way that your father responded to you or didn't respond to you based on what you did on the field. And I was fortunate. My father, he was supportive and he went to the games, but he was not going to base his identity based on what I did on the football field. He really, you could probably didn't give shit about football. He wasn't an athlete. I mean, he was just a different person. It's like anything, you later on in life become your often father, but you also learn to appreciate and understand what he was going through at that time. And
Yeah, there were, I really became more aware of it when my kids started playing sports and I started to interact and see other parents of other kids. And, when your kid's a young 8, 9, 10, there's some kids who you can just tell that kid's going to be a good athlete, but we haven't even physically formed yet. We're still growing. You see kids that break out later in adolescence and get muscular and stronger and faster. And so nobody really knows what's going to happen. And this vicariously living through your child because you weren't able to do something as an athlete,
Mm.
it's rampant, and
Oh, it
it's
is.
disgusting.
And
And
it's damaging.
it's very damaging. And the thing that's even more damaging than the overt vicarious living through the child is the subtle, right? Where
Hmm.
there's no yelling or screaming. There's just a kind of implied expectation that you're going to be really good at this and you're going to work really hard. And if you fail, I'm going to be really disappointed. And that message can be communicated non-verbally, right? And
Sure.
and
And,
you
and not when you do something good, but just the way that you look at them, you see them, your energy to them when they're winning could be increased. And like you said, this is subconscious. They're not even aware of it. But kids pick up on that and they don't know.
totally.
And they're trying to please you. Um, and then you bring that right into life all the way through.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, it
And
is damaging. And what I saw, it kind of manifests itself in the high school timeline is, some of these kids, get into drinking and drugs and trouble because they're like, fuck this, man. I can't live up to that expectation. So I'm gonna go self-medicate and so I can feel better about it. And I just think for our audience, I think that, when you're walking around, when you're interacting with your kids and their friends and at sporting events or dance recitals or whatever your thing is, you got to be conscious of the fact that the way that you hold yourself and the way that you act and what you say and how you talk to people, people are watching, maybe not all the time, but I was always the dad that showed up. I don't think I missed a practice, dude. I certainly didn't miss any games, but I was always there. And the same thing was with my kids and their education. I think my children got a good education at a public school because I interfaced with their teachers. Their teachers knew this guy gives a shit and they acted accordingly. So there's all
yeah,
kinds of different ways you can model behavior to the benefit or the detriment of your kids and their friends.
I say this with full disclosure, how much I value coaches. At the same time, that there's a different style of coach. When I was growing up, it was definitely more of a it was a profession, obviously, because they were typically school teachers that did sports. But sports has become coaching's become a profession, even in the amateur sports, and they're more interested in their egos and their own self-interest than they are often their own players. So there has been a shift, I think, when we were growing up in terms of the type of coaches than what we're seeing now. And I'm not at all suggesting they're all bad coaches, but there are some bad coaches that really are more interested in how they feel, and they completely forget about their players.
my my I wasn't very fortunate with the coaches that I had in high school. My father coached me up until the time I was 12, and won we won the championship every year. And I was probably the best player in town. I think my batting average when I was 12, Jim, was 875. I think we played 12 games and I had 15 home runs and I was 3-0 as a pitcher.
Wow.
I was untouchable and
Mhm.
I was a prick because of that. To your point
Or
earlier.
do you really reflect back and go, I was just a prick? I mean,
I,
do you know, when did you realize that? And that's kind of impressive that you're self-aware enough to do a self-evaluation when you were a kid. Was it because you were overconfident and you just felt that you were superior because you were on
you,
the
you know,
field?
it's probably unfair to say I was a prick. I was always kind of a good guy, but yeah, I remember I remember once I slid into second base, and the umpire called me out, and I jumped up and I went, "That's bullshit." And as soon as I said it, I saw my father running out to the field. And I think I remember him just dragging me off the field. And that's when I knew. That's when I knew you overstep your boundaries. You're being a prick. You might be a good baseball player, but that's not the most important thing in life. And you got to treat people better than that. And that's because that's how I was raised. And then the next year, 13, we went to the big field, from the little league field. And I stayed a 12-year-old kid for the next 3 years. No body hair, no maturation, no physical growth, nothing. That destroyed my confidence for a period of time. So, yeah, I mean, I think I've always been pretty self-aware, but that doesn't mean I didn't make mistakes. So that's
Yeah, that reminds me of, Mark, is that the era that we were coached, those were often World War II. I call them Vince Lombardi style coaches, and it served its purpose, and it was no question the type of coaches were typically influenced by the military, and that's become a big part of the sports culture in America. We talked about on the last podcast of sounding like a douche, looking like a douche, and that often comes from that sports male masculine uh, environment and upbringing that our identity at one time was based on. So what are your thoughts about that style of coach versus today, and how that fits into our identity?
Well, I think it's a valid point, but I also think, you look at a guy like Bill Belichick, he
Mhm.
comes from a military background and he's kind of a prick, and he has very high expectations and he doesn't pat people on the back, and he's old school, and that worked pretty good.
Well, what works in the NFL, and maybe let me repose the question. There's no question there's some very successful coaches that never even played the sport that they coach for. If they did, it
Mhm.
was at a lower level. I'm really talking more about the mentality of that coach. No pain, no gain. Try harder. Break them down and build them up. That breaking them down approach, it worked during its time, but it has done a lot more damage on a young man than building him up.
Well, I think two things. I think you kind of have to compartmentalize in life, right? You can't, something that works for you on the football field to win you a championship isn't necessarily going to work for you when you're talking to your child, your kid's teacher. I mean, so you have to you take on different roles in your life as a man depending on what function. I mean, when I take my daughter in to get stitches, I don't use the same voice as when I'm, on the sidelines cheering for her to win a game. So I think you have to be aware of that, because some of that Vince Lombardi stuff is still valuable, but it needs to be perhaps reconfigured for
Yeah,
the child, and because of some of the things that are going. One of the things that really confuses me is this stuff like football. Just take football, for instance. It's like they're getting rid of, I mean, you can't touch the quarterback anymore. You used to be able to hammer the quarterback, right? It was encouraged, right? I remember Daryl Stingley getting hit by Jack Tatum, getting paralyzed. You remember that? I know Daryl
oh
Stingley, the,
yeah,
the Patriot. And that the
yeah.
whole
Jack Tatum's
stadium.
Oakland Raider, one of the most
Yeah,
famous
I
Oakland
know.
Raiders. That
I
that
know.
was our style of football, and
That's
and,
right.
and yeah,
And
yeah, and
people cheered that behavior. And I think football's on the verge of perhaps disappearing altogether as it existed, because we're moving away from the violence, which on one hand is good, but on the other hand, it's one of the visceral reasons that people are attracted to football games, because of the brutality. So I
yeah,
don't know what the solution to that is, moving from old school to new school. But I think we have to be careful with that, because I think we're going to lose some of the good stuff if we're not careful. And everybody's looking for safe zones, and everybody's looking for a pat on the back, and everybody gets a trophy. I think all that's bullshit, right? I think there's somewhere in between that we need to seek.
when we were playing high school football, we were somewhat taught to lead with our head and our neck. That's what you did. There was drills where we were all trying to become Jack Tatum's. I know a lot about this. And remember, that was one of our first conversations. When I contacted you, I said, "Hey, Mark, well, I learned about Dr. Wood's program. I was dealing with the concussion issue that I didn't know much about before that. There's a pattern of this in the NFL of guys killing themselves, of depression, drugs, alcoholism. That I believe is highly related to the concussions, but it's also, in my opinion, as much the ego getting so big to go so high and so low. And because I played 20 consecutive seasons, uh, at a high level, I think the trauma was as much not just the physical part, but the emotional part of trying to fill that in my life through business or other activities when it's impossible. That high that you get when you win it all, and when you've proven to everybody that you're the best, uh, can come back and haunt you to some degree. So
Yeah, I
um,
think it's just a form of, it's retirement, right? It's this thing that I've done that has brought me so much joy, so much money, so much sense of self-worth is now gone. What the fuck do I do now?
yeah,
I
your
remember
identity, right?
yeah,
It's
it's all about your identity. I remember my father telling me when he got his wings in the Navy, all he ever wanted to be was a fighter pilot. He accomplished that. And he got his wings and he got in his plane and he went up to, I don't know, 20, 30,000 feet. I might be botching the metrics. He said he started crying because it was like, I just accomplished the only thing I've ever wanted to accomplish. What the hell do I do now?
mhm,
And
mhm.
that, I don't think most of us are ready for that. I experienced that in an empty nest fashion, and I've told you that story before when I came home from dropping off my daughter, and now none of my kids are in the house anymore, and my dog is the only creature awaiting me, and the loneliness was, oh man, it was thick, it was deep, it was palatable, and I'd never experienced anything like it before. And I think an NFL player retiring and not being able to enjoy that camaraderie, the locker room, the contact, the rigor, the sweat, the talk, um, that you can replace that, but you have to do that in a planned fashion. You have to be ready for that. If it just hits you in the side of the head, I mean, some of these guys, they don't fall into depression or suicide, but some of them just get fat because you can't eat the same way when you stop playing as you ate when you were playing. There's all kinds of planning around the onset of middle age, and I think most of what we talk about is the good things that come from some of the things that we do and some of the trauma that we experience along the way. And that's how you and I met. I mean, you came to the Inspired Performance Institute and you talked to me first after doing your own due diligence and research online. And you asked a bunch of good questions and you shared your story with me, particularly around the fear that you had that these concussions might endanger your life in some way, either take part of it away or change who you were or push you into a depressed state. Because we see examples of this, like you said, in the NFL, particularly, but in other sports too. We're just learning about this stuff, So, I think the work that Dr. Wood's doing is worth mentioning because every single one of us, and in our audience and out of our audience through life, has experienced trauma. Some of it is recognizable and memorable, and some of it is not. Some of it we don't remember. Some of it is extreme, like sexual abuse, and some of it is less so, like getting yelled at. But they're all traumatic experiences that, if unaddressed, they fester in our subconscious and they attack us as if they're happening again right now. And what the program does, the TIP program at the Institute, is it addresses that subconscious trauma and puts it back in the past where it belongs, so that when you're making decisions, and 90% of the decisions we make are subconscious decisions, that we're not being driven by that traumatic fear, that fight or flight sense that can actually become overwhelming. And the I've seen countless examples, like hundreds, if not thousands, of people have come through that program, and the results are astounding. And it doesn't appear to have anything to do with the nature of the trauma or the severity of the trauma or whether you can remember the trauma, because he is rewiring the subconscious mind, not the conscious mind. So you don't have to be cooperative or involved. You just have to be paying attention. And maybe you can share what that experience of going through the program did for you, Jim.
What I'd like to share is my experience of what led up to that. And because I had always produced or achieved the goals that I had, and I wanted to continue to do that at a high level, um, I had had some setbacks, and and even though I thought I was dealing with them, um, my identity was being reshaped. And this failure that I took I wouldn't say it's a business failure, but let's just say it didn't come to fruition the way that I had anticipated, like other things. And I just continued to apply that. If I just work harder, and I was applying the sports mentality to something that was much more complex. And this is a technology project. Um, but then it forced me to have to really to deal with some things that happened early on in life that I wouldn't say I covered up. I was aware of, but I found out really very, very later on in life. This is just actually a year or so ago that I had dyslexia. And it's actually so there's a form of dyslexia. It's dysgraphia and dyslexia and ADD and all of these labels. And it was obvious that as I was growing up, and even in business, it was challenging to do certain tasks. Reading came relatively easy, although I taught myself how to read when I was 19 years old through cassette audio books. Because I don't know if I ever told you, but I graduated from high school with a third grade reading level, and I didn't realize that until I was going to a junior college in the evening. I was making cabinets during the day, and the teacher asked me if she could talk to me. And I said, yeah, sure. What's wrong? I mean, I said, it was night school. I paid my $20 for my credit class. It was like an English class or something. And she said, I was just remembering how can I get held out after class in a night class, English class in junior college? Like, I didn't say a word. I was full of sawdust because I'd been working all day long. And she says, hey, Jim, you can't come back next week. And I was like, why? What happened? What did I do? She said, you took a test last week, and I hate to tell you this, but you're illiterate. You have a third grade reading level. And I just remember going, well, that's not good. I go, that's a problem. And she looked at me. She says, yeah, but you can't come back here because you're just not functional. And I just went, no, man. And then I went to my truck at the time in the parking lot, and I just remember going, I am so fucked right now. What am I going to do? And that just by coincidence at that time, Don had just won the College World Series at ASU with Barry Bonds, and was the MVP of the College World Series at that time. The same year, Jack had just won the Rose Bowl and was the MVP at the Rose Bowl. And here I am in the parking lot of junior college in Hayward, California, going, I'm such a fucking loser. But my expectation was, hey, I should just be those are my friends, and we played football together. I was a 3-year starter. They were actually the other two linebackers, if you believe that. And we had the best defense ever, with a total of 99 yards total rushing in a 7-game league season. So, but I just remember I said, this is going to shape my identity. If I don't figure this out, this is who I am. I mean, I'm worthless, right? And then I remember, I bought some tapes or something like that because I was taking Bart from Hayward to San Francisco, and I was listening to the tapes. I realized I never learned how to speak very well, a lot of slang, because I wasn't reading. And but anyway, obviously I figured it out. I'm not completely. So where I'm going with it is that I had suppressed a lot of these things and made up for it with either the sales records. I'd always be the top salesman or whatever. When I moved from making cabinets to selling cabinets, I started to do quite well in that area. But then later on in life, when I started to push myself, I had to deal with this for the first time in my life, depression, and that is some bad shit, man. I never thought I'd have to deal with that, but that's what a depression is. It is you're telling yourself your identity. There's something wrong with you, and it's just so damaging in so many different ways. So to save my marriage, I ended up, getting some tests and hired a bunch of people to tell me how fucked up I was. And they did a great job. But the bottom line was I had dyslexia, and I never had dealt with it. And this is, now I'm into my 50s, right? And but then they kept asking about history, and one of the evaluations or whatever doctors, she said, she started talking about rugby, and then the concussion thing came up, and then they counted the concussions because it became part of my record, and it was 35 concussions, is what we determined. So between high school, which we got a lot of fights, was common, getting fights. You didn't get kicked out of school, you got in trouble, but we used to get in a lot of fights. That was just part of the environment we grew up. It was the Oakland Raiders. And then high school football. And that high school football, the type of football we played, I was a linebacker, was leading with your head. And then after that, I got into a real bad car accident. If you ever see this scar right here, that's 60 stitches that basically split open my head, because I went through a windshield with, of course, no safety belt, with a drunk driver, and that didn't help as far as the concussion thing, because I was out for a while. And then went on to start to play rugby, and I did 20 straight seasons, and counted, and on average, going to get your bell rung, 2 or 3 times a year at least, right? So that times 20. And so by the time I got to you, I remember saying, hey, they're telling me this concussion thing may be something I have to deal with. I think it's kind of bullshit. I think everybody got the bell rung. But I need to tell you that, Mark. So, just so you know. And he said, well, I'm talking about you right now, right? You said, well, let me talk to the doctor. Let me come back to you on that. And I really value that, because you could have blown it off and just tried to sell me a program. Instead, you immediately, I don't know what, I'll let you tell how you, and then you came back to me and said, yeah, Dr. Wood says that he'll see you, but he really wants you to get the SPECT scan, because if you get the SPECT scan, you can start to understand really what's going on in your brain. And a SPECT scan is new technology. It's say an MRI of the brain. And side note, kind of interesting, that's what my father did at the University of California, Berkeley, for 35 years. He actually was on the team that created that technology of taking images. So that same technology my father worked on for 35 years, they're now using. When I went to Florida, the radiologist was explaining the technology, and then they basically put you on a table for 4 hours, and they just take a bunch of pictures of your brain, and they can see the blood flow, how it flows through your brain, and there's a blockage, just kind of like taking an X-ray of your knee. And this is new technology. In fact, it's so new that insurances don't cover it, and there's some doctors that don't believe in it. But that, for the first time, was a picture of the blood flow not going traveling like everybody else's. So some of this is just part of the aging process. That's very common. Dementia, Alzheimer's, those kind of diseases. It's kind of the same thing going on. So, but when I met with Dr. Wood, he set up the appointment for me in Florida to get the SPECT scan, but we didn't get the results until like a week later. He goes, if I was going to explain it to you, it'd be like you have a 6-cylinder car, and you're running on 2 cylinders, and that's one of the reasons you're having a hard time focusing. You're frustrated, and that causes all kinds of other effects. I ended up doing hyperbaric treatments to deal with that, among other things that Dr. Wood recommended. And but it was also the conversation I was having with myself, and then dealing with these traumas that you're referring to, that go way back to my identity. And I felt like in order to be to feel alive, I had to be the best, and the very best. And if I wasn't, I was a failure, and my identity just continued to crumble, quite honestly. But yet nobody knew, because I was hiding it.
Yeah, and you were performing at a high level. I mean, it's one of the things that I like best about Dr. Wood's approach is he starts with everybody saying, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. There's nothing wrong with your mind. You're a product of your experiences and your circumstances. And I remember him telling me the story about a young lady who was a heroin addict coming in one time, and she said, "Before we begin, Dr. Wood, my therapist told me to tell you that I have a self-destructive personality." And he said, "Why would you say something like that?" And she said, "Well, he thought, that you should know that it would make it easier for you to treat me if you knew that I was such." And he said, "No, I don't agree with that at all. I think if you had a self-destructive personality, that you wouldn't be here right now, that you would have successfully taken your own life with an overdose of heroin. When you put the needle in your arm, what are you doing? You're trying to feel better. You're just using the wrong tool." Right. I just thought that was fascinating. It's in its simplicity and its logic. And I think he comes to that conclusion from lots of research and lots of studies and lots of experience in developing this program. And I have yet to put somebody through this program that didn't experience some level of improvement. And you're describing a situation that's pretty severe in relative terms, but it doesn't seem to matter, because we're all being driven by our subconscious. And I don't think I had a very traumatic childhood, but I had a very contentious divorce, and that certainly was traumatic.
What was being challenged was your identity as a father,
Hmm.
as a person. I remember when we met for coffee, and you shared that, you were vulnerable, but also the humility of that, and you had a moment in time where you had to make a decision: is this going to break me or make me? And we
Yep.
all have those moments. And I was, obviously it's formed this relationship we have today. When you shared it with me in detail, and how you were determined to make that you were a better person. You even said, I'm a better person probably because of this experience. And that's what we all go through. But your identity was being challenged
It
as a
was.
father, as a husband. So
Yeah, and I
that
mean, I say in a different but similar fashion, I felt the same. I felt like I was a failure. Like I should have been able to fix this. I should have been able to do something about this. And I discovered later on that that's not the case. But I think in middle age, reflecting back on previous hardships, or looking forward to the next one, these things don't stop coming. Right? Hardship doesn't stop coming. No one is immune to it. And I really, really feel strongly about this idea. It's one of the reasons we're doing this podcast, is that you and I have had some experiences that aren't necessarily unique. They are because everyone is unique, but their hardship is not unique to us. And I don't want to win the contest about who has the biggest hardship. It's not a trophy I have ever sought out. But I think when those hardships come, you gotta make the decision. Am I gonna be the miserable blame guy, or I'm gonna figure this out guy? And
Yeah, you
I think
become
both.
bitter, you
Yeah,
become better, you become bitter.
yeah, I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
both of us are figure it out guys, and I think that I encourage other men to be figure it out guys too. It's saddens me when I see people who I know and love. They've chosen, maybe not the bitter, but they've chosen to give up. They've chosen to lay on the couch. They've chosen to stop moving around. They've chosen to buy new clothes instead of eat better and lose that weight. They've made these bad choices because I think they feel like that's the only choice I have, and it's not. It's just
Well,
not.
we all isolate, and we to protect ourselves. I think that's pretty common, right? To isolate, not to share, not to surround yourself with people to flush these things out. That's what good friends do, and in your environment. But I want to go back to something you said about addiction. Uh, I believe we all have addictions to some degree. It's just a level of addiction, and we all self medicate. Uh, and when I reflect back on what the 20 seasons of rugby did, was was became an addiction. The addiction is to feed my ego. So everybody has the same problem. That's not unique to me, right? That's the monster, is to feed the ego of our identity and what we feel like, what our value is to the world that we're living in, or in our minds. And I see it all the time. You could see running is an addiction, right? Runners have an addiction, um, and their self medication is relatively healthy for you. But everything can be extreme. So I appreciate what you're saying as far as there's nothing wrong with you. These are normal things. And work has become an addiction. And it's the only addiction in American society that's not just accepted, but encouraged. That's fucked some people up pretty bad.
Yeah.
And how they self-medicate is through, coffee, eating. These are the things that have a long-term health effect on us. So yeah, let's talk about addiction and self-medication, and maybe it ties into what you're saying about letting yourself go or not dealing with the health, mental and physical health
Well, I think
effects that has.
yeah, I think that's we're going to talk about health in an upcoming podcast, and we can get deep into that there. I think to tie this up a little bit in terms of, Dr. Wood and the program, and if you want to find out more about the program, we'll have a link in the show notes, and you can go do your own due diligence. And if you end up speaking to someone, that someone will be me, so there'll be a familiar voice on the other end. And if you don't have any interest in that, that's cool too. That's a personal choice. But I think if you're struggling with any of these things, and you're not performing at the level that you'd like to be, and that could be any level of performance: physical performance, professional performance, mental, spiritual, emotional performance. It's all performance. You think you got another gear and you're being limited by something and you can't get your arms around it, I think it's worthy of investigation. But
Yeah, Mark, if I would just add to that, there's no question if this program's great if that's within your financial and emotional budget. But just to your point, there's some great reading out there. We know a lot more about the mind than ever before. It has a stigma, particularly mental health and depression, that more people have to start talking about, because suppressing it doesn't do any good. And whether it's self-educating by learning more about it, and then being a part of a group or somebody you can talk to, it doesn't go away on its own. And there's many ways to get help. So I appreciate you saying that. It's not just the TIP program to address some of these issues. That's a journey that can be taken in many different directions.
Yeah, and I would just say, don't give up. This journey's not over. It's and one of the things I think I said to you, I say it to a lot of people that come to the Institute is, look, I think you're going to be okay no matter what you choose to do, because I can hear in your voice that you're not going to give up until you are, right? And I think that's really all you need, is the fortitude and the commitment to say, I'm not settling for all these things that are happening to me in midlife. My kids are moving out, and maybe my marriage has broken up, or I'm getting fat, I'm getting tired, I'm not sleeping as well as I could have. Those are choices that you're making. Those are not inevitable things. There are things you can do about that, and prescription medication isn't the only solution. As a matter of fact, it might be the worst solution, right? I'm not a doctor, but when someone says to you, we're not sure what caused this, and just take these pills, take 2 of them a day for the rest of your life, that's a cop out as far as I'm concerned. That's not a solution. That's a Band-Aid to a symptom. And I
And
think
the side effects often on those drugs are worse than the initial effect that it was having on you. So
it's
I'm
like
not
this.
opposed to drugs at all. But like you said, you have to be your own doctor, and there's many other factors. A pill is not the solution to every problem. In fact, it's often the problem. So I appreciate you talking about
Yeah, I
that.
think you just got to find out what it means to eat well, and you got to clear out your subconscious, however you can do that, to get out of your own way. And you got to move around, and I think doing those things will bring an increased level of hope and optimism to your future, and it'll help you model a much more positive identity for whomever you are around and influencing. Yeah, I think in order, the next podcast, we're going to dig deeper into health. And I don't just mean physical, I mean mental and emotional as well. So, thanks again, Jim. That was a good conversation, and I look forward to the next one.
Sounds great. Talk soon, Mark.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.